leaving it for them to perceive, rather than highlighting it himself, coheres rather strikingly with the strategy of protective anonymity in relation to certain characters in this narrative. What put these persons in danger in Jerusalem in the period of the earliest Christian community would be their complicity in Jesus' alleged seditious behavior in the days before his arrest. Gerd Thiessen adds, only in Jerusalem was there reason to draw a cloak of anonymity over followers of Jesus who had endangered themselves by their actions. The date could also be pinpointed. Parts of the Passion account would have to have been composed within the generation of the eyewitnesses and their contemporaries, that is, somewhere between 30 and 60 AD. This indicates Mark preserves early traditions that would have been formulated by the first Christians in Jerusalem, and strengthens the case his information came from eyewitnesses who had a motive to protect those close to Jesus. Another indication Mark received his information from eyewitnesses is the appearance of onomastic congruence in his gospel. Luke Vandewey says, onomastic congruence refers to the creation of naming patterns by an ancient author that appropriately reflects the data of relevant prosopographies. In other words, an ancient work has onomastic congruence if the names within the body of the work align well with the ratio of names we find from that period. For example, the most popular name from Judea in the 1st century is Simon. If someone was writing a history of Judea from the 1st century, we should expect that the most popular name in their work should be Simon. Names like Matthew or Annas should appear much less throughout the work, given they were not as popular as names like Simon or Joseph. We should also expect that because Simon was such a popular name, an author will find a way to distinguish those that have the same name, like referring to one Simon as Simon son of Jonah, or another as Simon the Tanner. Whereas less popular names, like Zacchaeus, will have no need for distinguishing them. So if an ancient work contains a naming pattern that aligns well with the distribution of names from the time and place it purports to come from, this supports its reliability. Vandewey says a work with onomastic congruence has 3 factors: a relatively significant number of appropriate proper names, a relatively increased level of detail in proper names, patterns of proper names reflecting the situation on the ground. Seldom will a non-historiographical work surveyed in our study contain any one of these 3 features. It never contains all 3. Vandewey put this to the test and surveyed the naming patterns in various ancient works to see which ones would contain onomastic congruence. The apocryphal Gospels, various tragedies and novels, were found to lack onomastic congruence. Surprisingly, even some Greco-Roman biographies failed to achieve onomastic congruence. Thus, Vandewey noted lacking onomastic congruence doesn't mean a work is not historical or reliable, but if a work does achieve it, it strengthens its overall reliability. The only biographies to obtain onomastic congruence were Josephus' autobiography, Plutarch's Lives, and Suetonius' 12 Caesars. Interestingly enough, Craig Keener says these biographies marked the height of historical reliability and were written at a time when biographical expectations for historical reliability were at their highest. The fact that Vandewey finds onomastic congruence in all 3 supports this conclusion. However, Vandewey also found onomastic congruence in Mark's Gospel, which puts it in a category along with the most reliable biographies of the ancient world. Mark managed to achieve what many other biographers could not. His work aligned with the naming patterns from the time and region he wrote about. Thus, Mark is most likely a reliable biography about the life and ministry of Jesus. Additionally, Raymond Martin performed a syntactical analysis on Mark. He found that it contains a combination of translated Semitic material and original Greek material. And Vandewey points out, names cluster around the most primitive material in Mark. Vandewey notes Josephus, Plutarch, and Suetonius could consult archival material and eyewitnesses. Mark would not have been able to consult archives on the life of Jesus. But the fact that someone like Mark achieved onomastic congruence only makes sense if he was consulting those who witnessed the ministry of Jesus. Names also cluster around significant functions and events. Scott McKnight notes in rabbinic texts, lists of disciples come with elaborations of their piety and describe their legacy. This type of commentary is missing in Mark and the other Gospels. In fact, the listing of the 12, serves no narrative importance. Most of the disciples do not even utter any words in Mark or play a prominent role. The only reason they would have been mentioned is to preserve an authentic list of tradents that was responsible for passing on the information Mark obtained. McKnight says, "The text of the Babylonian Talmud discredits Jesus, his disciples, and the emerging church by the absence of favorable witness for Jesus and by exegesis. The lists of the disciples in the earliest Jesus traditions are stark and nearly absent of commentary. Their intentions appear to be nothing more than a list in order to know who are the authentic tradents of the Jesus tradition." In other words, Mark was not writing a fictional account, but preserving names of eyewitnesses to indicate his information came from reliable sources. The list of the 12 also shows signs of being a primitive tradition. Vandewey notes it begins with Peter, followed by James the son of Zebedee, and then John is identified as his brother. The authorial perspective clearly considers James the more prominent disciple, even qualifying John as the brother of James, despite John's rise to prominence after the death of James around 44 CE. It is unlikely this list would have been worded this way if it was a late tradition that came after the death of James. John would not have been identified as merely the brother of James. We see that Matthew and Luke both dropped this designator, with Matthew only noting he was his brother. The list also contains Aramaisms, appropriate qualifiers, and mnemonic features. When the disciples were not present, Mark includes other names to likely indicate use of eyewitness testimony. He names specific women who were at the cross and the tomb to serve as a list of witnesses to the death of Jesus and the discovery of the empty tomb. Mark notes it was Simon the Cyrene who carried the cross for Jesus, but he unnecessarily adds that he is the father of Alexander and Rufus. This reference doesn't serve any purpose, other than it being an attempt to name reliable tradents who can confirm his story. A church tradition suggests Mark was writing while Peter was preaching in Rome, and interestingly enough, Paul's letter to the Romans mentions a Rufus present. The simplest explanation is Mark mentions Rufus and Alexander because they were in Rome as well, and could confirm the eyewitness testimony of their father. Richard Bauckham says, "The reference to Alexander and Rufus may presuppose that Mark expected many of his readers to know them, in person or by reputation, but this cannot by itself explain why they are named. There does not seem to be a good reason available, other than that Mark is appealing to Simon's eyewitness testimony, known in the early Christian movement, not from his own first-hand account, but from that of his sons." If Mark was writing a fictional account, divorced from eyewitness testimony, there would be no reason to include names like this. But such a task was necessary if one was writing a reliable biography, as one would need to reference eyewitnesses and reliable tradents to confirm his report. Vandewey says, "Names of these individuals and other informants were especially conserved as living footnotes of the oral repository, explaining why a pattern of onomastic congruence, on par with that of the highest biographies of antiquity, should be found in the communal memories of an itinerant Galilean rabbi." Travis Derrico investigated oral traditions in northern Jordan. Luke Vandewey suggested the high percentage of names in Derrico's transcripts are best explained by their function as informants that can confirm an aspect of the tradition being referenced. This would align with Mark's naming structure. He is informing his readers of eyewitnesses and tradents to support what he is stating is true. Richard Bauckham notes we find similar practices in other ancient works. In Plutarch's Life of Caesar, he details Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon, which is absent from Caesar's own writings. The account contains one personal name, Asinius Pollio. There is no literary reason to indicate Pollio was present, other than that Plutarch was informing his audience that this was the eyewitness account he utilized to write accurate information about Caesar. Christopher Pelling said, "The name here almost serves as a source citation." Cornelius Nepos wrote in Life of Atticus that Atticus was dying and decided to end his life by starving to death. Nepos wrote he gave instructions for his son-in-law Agrippa to be summoned, and Lucius Cornelius Balbus and Sextus Peducius along with him. He then explained his intentions and resisted Agrippa's attempt to persuade him not to. Balbus and Peducius play no role in the account. Bauckham says it's likely they were included to function as witnesses to the event. Nicholas Horsfall said, "As it is, a witness would have told Nepos. Both Balbus and Peducius would have known well the mold in which such accounts should be cast." Josephus records the capture of the Jewish city of Gamla and said, "Not a soul escaped save 2 women. These were nieces on the mother's side of Philip, son of Jacomus, a distinguished man who had been commander-in-chief to King Agrippa." Bauckham says, "Why does Josephus give this information about the nieces of Philip? Since readers of the war know little about Philip, the fate of 2 obscure members of his family would not seem to be notable enough to be mentioned for its own sake. The reason Josephus refers to the nieces is surely to identify them as the eyewitness sources on which, directly or indirectly, his narrative of the events of Gamla during the siege was based." Bauckham lists other examples where ancient authors included names irrelevant for the story, but were likely included to function as living footnotes to indicate reliability. One should not doubt their account, because they list eyewitnesses who were present and can verify their reports. Likewise, when Mark wrote and named individuals that were not relevant for telling the story of Jesus, the reason is they likely are eyewitnesses or reliable tradents that he was aware of and can confirm his account. Such a practice would be useless if Mark was writing a fictional account, but necessary if he was writing an historical account that came from eyewitnesses and could be verified by eyewitnesses. As we noted, Maurice Casey and James Crossley argued Mark's source had to be a member of the 12, but additional evidence takes this one step further and confirms Mark's main source was Peter. Mark uses a literary device called inclusio of eyewitness. This is where one refers to their primary eyewitness source at the beginning and end, and Mark opens by referencing Peter and ends with a reference to Peter. We see a similar technique in other biographies. Lucian in Life of Alexander has a reference in the beginning to someone named Rutilianus. He also frequently mentioned him throughout and at the end. Bauckham says, just like the Petrine inclusio in the Gospel of Mark, Rutilianus is both the first character in the story, apart from Alexander, to be named, and the last to be mentioned by name. In Porphyry's Life of Plotinus, he opens by naming Emilius, a disciple of Plotinus. Apart from Plotinus and Porphyry, he is the most named person and is the first and last to be named in the biography. Likewise, Mark opens by naming Peter, frequently references him throughout, and ends with referencing Peter. This technique is absent in Matthew and Luke, and references to Peter are minimized. This suggests Mark employed the literary device of inclusio of eyewitness to demonstrate his main source was Peter. Mark opens with Peter and ends with a reference to Peter, to remind readers this is Mark's main source. We also see Mark use a plural to singular narrative device. This is where a plural verb, without an explicit subject, is used to describe the movement of Jesus and his disciples, but then it is followed immediately by a For example, Mark 1:21 says, "And they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and was teaching." Mark 5 says, "They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes, and when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit." Mark 11:12 says, "On the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry." We can see the text starts with a reference to the whole group. Then it focuses in on what Jesus did. In these parallel passages in Matthew and Luke, they prefer a singular verb to Mark's plural when dealing with Jesus and his disciples. They often only refer to the movement of Jesus without referring to the disciples moving along with him. Now, if Peter was reciting this to Mark, he would state it as, "We came from Bethany, and he was hungry." Mark would then write the "we" as "they," but retain the sense of the group moving as one. If Mark was getting his information from someone who moved around with Jesus, we would expect this plural to singular device. The narrative is told from the experience of an eyewitness of Jesus, moving within his group of disciples. Mark is giving the narrative from an insider's perspective, and from a member of the group who was moving around with Jesus. As Bauckham says, the plural to singular narrative device in Mark meets the test for internal focalization, that it is possible to rewrite the passage substituting first-person forms for the third-person references to the focalizing characters. While the Petrine inclusio is Mark's literary means of indicating Peter as the main eyewitness source of the gospel, the plural to singular narrative device appropriately makes the dominant perspective, internal focalization, within the gospel's narrative, the perspective of Peter and those closest to him. It enables readers to share the eyewitness perspective on the events that Peter's testimony embodied. Going beyond this, we find extra details that center around Peter's involvement, and he is spotlighted like no other disciple. We find him at times speaking on behalf of the group, as well as being addressed in place of the whole group. And we find a combination of both. When Peter is on the scene, his perspective is given more detail in comparison to the other disciples. In Mark 9, Peter's motives are disclosed to the reader, something Mark could only have known if he had heard this from Peter. In Mark 14, Peter is physically removed from the other disciples, and his story is told apart from the others. Peter understanding or having a misunderstanding often sets the tone of the narrative. In Mark 8, Peter makes one of the greatest proclamations of the person of Christ, only to be called Satan by Jesus a few statements later, due to his ignorance. In Mark 14, Peter makes the bold proclamation of loyalty above all the other disciples. By verses 66 to 72, he is denying Christ altogether. At the end, Peter is oddly singled out. The women are instructed to tell the disciples and Peter. Since Peter was a disciple, there is no literary reason to single him out. But it would be expected if Peter is Mark's main source. We find a similar practice in other ancient works that identified eyewitness sources. Mark wants his readers to know Peter was specific after Jesus. Peter is the most frequently named person in Mark. As Bauckham says, Mark's gospel not only, by its use of the inclusio of eyewitness testimony, claims Peter as its main eyewitness source. It also tells the story predominantly, though by no means exclusively, from Peter's perspective. Peter is uniquely spotlighted throughout this gospel, indicating much of it came from his perspective. Interestingly enough, when Peter is dropped out of the narrative by chapter 15, we see Mark list other eyewitnesses and reliable trade-ins to confirm his story. This is where he mentions Simon the Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, indicating a source for his information. He also mentions 3 women by name who were witnesses, along with Joseph of Arimathea. There are 7 occurrences of verbs for seeing with the women as the subjects, which points to the idea they were eyewitnesses that Mark relied on for this part of the story. In fact, numerous commentators have said that Mark regarded the women as eyewitness sources. John Donahue and Daniel Harrington said, "The use of the imperfect 'were observing' suggests that these women took in everything from start to finish. Having witnessed Jesus' death, they also witnessed his burial, and so on Easter morning, they did not go to the wrong tomb. Their chief function is to serve as witnesses to the events and the places in which these events occurred." So Mark indicates throughout his gospel Peter was his main source. When Peter was not present for the crucifixion or the discovery of the empty tomb, Mark points to women and others as his sources for information. So as we can see, the internal evidence overwhelmingly confirms the tradition that the Gospel of Mark was authored by Mark, the interpreter of Peter. We can see that Mark translated underlying Aramaic sayings that most likely came from a member of the 12. He had knowledge of Jewish customs from Judea, and early traditions that reflect the needs and worries of the first Christians in Jerusalem. Mark managed to achieve a naming pattern of onomastic congruence, something only the most sophisticated and well-documented biographers of the time could achieve. And he indicates his main source was Peter through literary devices, like plural to singular pronouns, inclusio of eyewitness, and constantly telling the story from Peter's perspective. When Peter is not present, Mark refers to other individuals, like other ancient authors did, to indicate his information still came from eyewitnesses. And of course, when we look at the external evidence, it confirms the same thing that the internal evidence points to. Mark, who was a follower of Peter, composed a gospel based on what Peter taught. This is on top of all the evidence, which overwhelmingly confirms the reliability of the Gospels. We are not dealing with late legends, but reliable and authoritative accounts that go back to eyewitnesses. Therefore, the external and internal evidence confirms the church tradition of Markan authorship. Mark preserves eyewitness accounts about the life and teachings of Jesus.